Sam Herder is at Hero Sports. He's a senior analyst for the FCS. He joins us on 365 Sports. Sam, thanks for your time with Paul Craig and also David Smoke. Your thoughts about, at least through the first full weekend of the season, the FCS. We saw some of their better teams, obviously defending national champions, South Dakota State, North Dakota State, others. Just overall, your overview and summary of the weekend.
Yeah, it was one of those weekends where, as a FCS top 25 voter, really hard to gauge a lot of the top 25 teams because there were so many FCS versus FBS games, and it's really hard to get a good gauge on that because in past years we've seen some FCS teams beat FBS teams, and then that FCS team not even go on to make the playoffs. We've also seen very, very ugly FCS versus FBS results, and that FCS team still go on to make a really deep playoff run and a push for a national title. So a tough gauge, but overall, there were 0 FCS over FBS wins in week 1. There was maybe like 25 to 30 games where it was a really close game at halftime, and then the depth of the FBS just kind of took over in the second half. And then there was like 6 or 7 one-score games where the FCS had a really good opportunity to beat FBS opponents, but came 1 or 2 plays short. So on most years, there's anywhere between 6 to 12 FCS over FBS wins. We only have one so far this year that went back to week 0 when Montana State beat New Mexico. So from an FCS perspective, you'd like to see a little bit more of these wins come through, but didn't happen so far through week 1.
So when you look at a game like North Dakota State and Colorado, what does that tell you about North Dakota State? Who's always good, but are they maybe ready to take that mantle back as the number 1 team in the FCS?
I think South Dakota State is still the top team, and that's why it's so hard to gauge because NDSU looked better against Colorado than South Dakota State looked against Oklahoma State. But Oklahoma State is probably a much better team than Colorado. So that's why it's so hard to balance those two things. But I think overall with the NDSU Colorado game, we saw a little bit of swagger back in NDSU, which might sound weird because they are such a well-known and still the best program in the FCS. But when it comes to the best team in the FCS, South Dakota State has kind of taken that mantle the last couple of years and kind of knocked NDSU back a couple of pegs. So I think just with how the Bison looked, they came ready to play. They threw the first couple of punches there. And so I think a lot of FCS fans watched that NDSU game against Colorado and said, okay, the offense looks really good. The defense, especially the secondary, has work to do, but there's no Travis Hunter and Shadir Sanders in the FCS, so the secondary for NDSU will be pretty fine. Overall, I think a lot of people were impressed with the performance that NDSU put together.
Sam, just in terms of expectations, being based here in Texas, I see Incarnate Word at number 12. They're 1-0. Tarleton State lost to Baylor. They also were out their starting quarterback. But just your kind of expectations for those two teams and just kind of the state of Texas in the FCS.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm sure a lot of your listeners are, they don't follow the FCS a whole lot, maybe just casual FCS listeners and reviewers and really pay attention to the FBS and the Power Four. And so oftentimes on FBS centric shows, it's they find it interesting that the power in the FCS is so Midwest, that the Dakotas and the Montana schools are kind of the dominant teams. Meanwhile, teams in the South have not struggled, but they're definitely, there's a gap between them in the Montana and Dakota schools, and part of that has to do with FCS to FBS realignments. There's been a lot of teams in the southeast from the FCS that have moved up to the FBS, but there are still some programs with potential. You talked about UIW. They made a semifinal run a couple of years ago, but then they kind of their coach left and took a lot of transfers with them. I think they'll be a good solid team, and they do play South Dakota State. They travel up to Brookings this weekend, so that'll be a good test for UIW. And then Tarleton State is the interesting one. I believe you guys have had their head coach on the show before, and they're not shy about their aspirations beyond the FCS, right? They want to go FBS someday. I don't know when that'll be. It could be next year. It could be in 5 years. But they support football really well. They fund football very well. This is their first year playoff eligible in the FCS. And I think they have a really good chance to be in the FCS playoffs. We'll see with their quarterback situation. Their starting quarterback got hurt. I think it was a thumb injury in week 0, and their offense looks completely different with him sidelined. I would expect him to be back at some point. And if he's healthy, I think this Tarleton team could be a FCS playoff team this year.
Speaking of injury, Jack Lane of Vanderbilt, Idaho, the Vandals, broke a collarbone, out for several weeks. Yeah, I think I saw a note where Jack Wagner takes over. Your thoughts about the Vandals losing their quarterback?
Yeah, it's a tough one. And it was interesting in the offseason because Giovanni McCoy, last year's starting quarterback for Idaho, he transferred and he won the starting job at Oregon State. It was interesting because Idaho fans, a lot of them didn't really flinch when McCoy entered the transfer portal. That's because they knew they had this Jack Lane kid, who's now a redshirt sophomore. They knew he was waiting in the wings and had potential to be just as good as McCoy. And again, it's a tough gauge because he looked okay throwing the ball against Oregon. But overall, Idaho battled Oregon really tough. I think it was like a 49.5 point underdog for Idaho, and it was 17-14 at one point in the fourth quarter. And so Idaho fans were kind of riding a high there, and then they get the news that their starting quarterback is going to be out several weeks. So that's a tough blow. They'll have to rely on their run game a little bit. Their defense looked phenomenal, so they'll lean on their defensive side of the football as well. But Wagner, he's a redshirt freshman. He's a 3-star recruit out of Oregon, so he's a highly touted recruit. Can he step in as a second-year freshman and do what Jack Lane can do? We'll have to see, but hopefully Jack Lane can get.
Sam Herder covers the FCS very, very well. You can go to his, if you want to, Twitter feed is at Sam Herder, FCS, and of course, Hero Sports is where he's at. You do have South Dakota State coming off the loss to Oklahoma State, and there's Incarnate Word, who Craig brought up earlier, number 12. That game is at South Dakota State. Your thoughts on that game, and then Montana, 4th-ranked team against 23rd-ranked North Dakota.
Yeah, it's going to tell us a lot about UIW because, like I said, 2 years ago they made they advanced all the way to the semifinals. Last year they had a pretty good winning record, but they didn't make the playoffs just because their playoff resume, which in the FCS world, a lot of people are evaluating your playoff resume, strength of schedule and ranked wins and conference strength. And UIW last year just played in a Southland conference, and I thought the Southland was really down last year. So they're looking to change minds this year and prove that they are a playoff level team, and they have a prime opportunity to show that they are a playoff level team by going to South Dakota State and battling tough. I don't think a lot of people I don't know anyone predicting UIW to win that game, but if it's a 28-21 type of game, then you go, okay, that's a respectable performance by UIW. If it's 48-7, okay, South Dakota State is still light years ahead of some of those teams in the South. And so that one is really intriguing. And then, Montana going to UND. The Fighting Hawks, they have a really good home field advantage. They can pack that stadium. It gets really loud in there. It's an indoor venue named the Alara Center. In Montana, the national runner-up last year, they bring a lot of guys back from last year's squad. They bring in like 15 FBS transfers as well. So Montana is a very, 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 very talented team, obviously, because they're number 4 in the country, but they kind of have a tendency to get off to a slow start and, make things gel. And they have a 2-quarterback system right now. They're not really sure who they want to go with as their starting quarterback. This is not the game where you can have a slow start and kind of just feel things out, because if you do that, you're going to go to UND and lose that game. And so Montana barely beat an unranked Missouri State team at home last weekend. Kind of a choppy performance. If they perform like that against a ranked UND team on the road, the Grizz could be in trouble for having an early season loss here.
Sam, I'm curious about the SWAC, and mostly because Florida A&M suffered, I think, the worst coaching loss you could have, where Willie Simmons, who'd done a really great job there, is now the running back coach at Duke. So he left that gig, and I know that they've had, all of them have different, schools have different athletic department issues. Florida A&M particularly had some recently, but how do you see him leaving affecting that squad that should be pretty good?
Yeah, Florida A&M to me is still the favorite in the SWAC. There's just so much roster turnover with them because when their head coach did leave, the hiring process was very, very messy with Florida A&M. It took a long time. It upset a lot of fans just with the direction they were going and not naming a new head coach until they did name James Cozy the new head coach. But during that time, a lot of players did leave as well. There's still a good nucleus of guys coming back, coupled with I think it's close to 30 FBS transfers coming in to Florida A&M. So that's obviously a very high number. How all that gels, we'll see. But the talent is there for Florida A&M to make it back to the Celebration Bowl. Always still intrigued with Jackson State as well. You know, they obviously made headlines a few years ago with Deion Sanders as head coach, and the level of recruits and the level of national attention that he brought to Jackson State. Obviously, when he left, he brought a lot of his top players with him. Some of that momentum went away, but at the same time, I still think Jackson State is still carrying on that momentum in a little bit, just with recruiting and transfers, because maybe a lot more people are familiar with the Jackson State brand, just with what Coach Sanders did there a few years ago. So I still think Jackson State has the talent to also make it very interesting in the SWAC race.
Last thing, Sam, thanks for your time. We appreciate it. We'll try to get you back on as the season progresses, just as an update, because there's some good teams. Do they deal with FCS? You mentioned something about their playoff resume when I think it was Incarnate Word. Do they have politics involved in how the playoffs are set up in the FCS like you might see elsewhere?
Yeah, I think there is. A lot of it has to do with your brand. Like Montana State, they have such well-known brand names where if Montana has the same playoff resume as an Abilene Christian, people just assume Montana is going to be the better team. I mean, I'm just picking out Montana here because they're such a well-known brand name. People just assume that Montana's the better name or the better team, even though they have the same resume as a team like Abilene Christian, just as an example, because of that brand. And I think there's also some stuff with, who's the higher seed, who hosts, because the NCAA does take a lot of ticket revenue, and so the NCAA is going to make more money if Montana is hosting more games rather than if UIW is hosting more games, because there's going to be 20,000 more people buying tickets. And so there's politics. I can't say for sure that, that's why they're making some of their seeding selections and all of that. But if you follow the FCS close enough, you can kind of read between the lines on why some teams get in, why some teams don't, why this team is a 2 seed and this team's a 7 seed, even though their resumes are pretty the same. There are some politics involved with it, just like, with the CFP, there's probably gonna be some politics and behind the scenes involved with that as well.
Thank you, Sam. Appreciate it. FCS Senior Analyst, also Heroes. That's part of what he does. Heroes Sports. Sam Herder with us on 365 Sports.